we might as well reply to it, since it is a particularly important question in Scotland, where we are. He asked us what our viewer is. And when I say our, there is no organization, so our just means individual views. So the question is, what is my own individual view on the question of independence for Scotland? We haven't said anything about it, and in the seminars. So I'm going to try and reply, and the reply is exclusively my own reply, as it were. Well, in the first instance, of course, on the in 2014, I voted, and I voted for independence for Scotland, and I wrote as much in critique, if anybody wants to look it up. But there are plenty of people around critique, insofar as there are plenty of people at all who wouldn't agree with that, and of course a lot of the left didn't agree with it. Some of course did. Well, I don't have an absolute position. As far as I was concerned, it appeared at that time the right thing to do, but I don't think it necessarily is at all times. The reason is that the question of independence isn't at the same level as the question of socialism. It's a means to an end. It is not a new system of society, and independence. The question is, what would independence do for the majority of the population, for the working class, which are most people anyway, in Scotland? Is there any advantage in it? And is it necessary? Is it correct? Would it be part of a movement to socialism? If it isn't, what on earth is it? It just seemed to me at that time it might provide some sort of beginning. Well, it's quite clear that the party in power in Scotland, so far as it has power, is not socialist. It's you can call it centre-left at most. So a simple move to independence. It's not clear exactly where that would lead. What they want, the party involved, is to join the EU. Now, the EU is far from socialism. The EU, in fact, specifically states that it's against nationalization, that in fact countries ought not to have nationalized forms. It is opposed to nationalization. Now, a nationalized form isn't necessarily a social form, but a nationalized form leading to a socialized form is necessary in a socialist society. So simply banning a particular form which is necessary to go to socialism is saying that it is against socialism. Well, of course, the EU is against socialism. So if one looks at it in those terms, then the majority party is against socialism. That's the implication. At the same time, I know that, of course, many of the members, I don't know about many, but a lot of the members may well be socialist, and there's a socialist tradition within Scotland. That's why I did originally vote for it, but I don't think it's as simple as that. I think the correct demand is for socialism, and to simply demand independence without mentioning socialism is an abdication, it seems to me, of what one ought to be demanding. What we ought to be trying to do is to build up socialist parties, or socialist party, a party which will go towards the full expropriation of the means of production, for a truly democratic form over the society, both in terms of the means of production and everyday existence. That's what we ought to be standing for. The move towards entering the EU is neither here nor there, and it's not at all clear that it would move. In fact, it's almost certain it wouldn't move anywhere. The EU, insofar as one can say anything about it, it is not only not socialist, it is anti-socialist. However, having said that, whether one moves into it or not is an issue within capitalism itself. For myself, again, when it came to vote on the issue, I abstained because it didn't seem to me a question which one could decide within capitalism. At one level, it is, from the point of view of a socialist, at one level one could say it is superior, at another level it is worse. Certainly within capitalism, it's hard to see how Britain could exist outside the EU just like that. Well, it's now outside the EU and in tremendous trouble because, of course, it intended to do a deal with the United States, and that is now at least largely off the table. Anyway, it does seem to me that's what any discussion of independence for Scotland is going to end up with, exactly how it relates to these various other entities and whether that will be any good for it. Well, Scotland is not a rich country. If it entered the EU, it would almost certainly have to be subsidized. A considerable number of countries within the 27 do receive a subsidy of some kind or other. The United Kingdom as a whole, of course, was subsidizing the rest of the EU to the tune of 10 billion. So one would expect that if Scotland entered it, given its GDP, it would get a certain subsidy, which might be advantageous. However, in general, as far as I can see, what we ought to be doing really is standing for socialism. The question of whether one votes or doesn't vote for independence, to me, is a secondary issue. Whether one stays in or doesn't stay in, it will be tough anyway, both ways. That's as far as I want to go on that issue. Perhaps just to say that I respect people who vote for independence. There is a sense in it. On the other hand, I think hoping to get very much from it is pretty dubious. Right. Now we're going to the second topic, which is the question of decline. Well, the issue is complicated, obviously, but it's complicated by the fact that the concept of decline was, in Marxist terms or in socialist terms, was put forward by Lenin. And he was arguing that the capitalist society was declining from 1870, effectively. In other words, he was referring to the invasion by the European powers, the developed European and developed capitalist powers of Europe into the rest of the world, most particularly into Africa and Asia. And of course, if one simply starts from that point, it's not difficult to say there's a decline. What an awful thing actually happened. Nowadays, it's becoming standard, but it didn't used to be so. That's to say, the invasion by Britain France, Germany, etc., into the third world was simply described in history books as a great thing or something that was neutral. The fact that 10 million people were killed by the Belgian government in the Congo wasn't mentioned, and if a mention was made, then they gave a much smaller figure. It's only fairly recently that the figure of 10 million was produced. Well, what kind of civilization is it that does that? So Lenin starts really from this point where the great powers who are not democratically elected, the individual governments, remember, were not democratically elected. We have to remember that democracy itself is very new. In Britain, we can talk of the vote for all, that's over 21, only from 1928 onwards. So what one's talking about is the great powers with a government which is effectively part of the elite or the ruling class, which is elected by a minority and by a small minority often, is expanding itself at that time and conquering parts of the world and simply wiping out parts of the world from their people. So it's not surprising that Lenin would start from that point. At the same time, one has a separate concept, which is produced in 1917, that we are in a transitional epoch. So there are two concepts which a Marxist has to deal with, struggle with at the present time in order to try and make sense of the present. That it's a period of decline for capitalism, and it's a transitional epoch. And that's to say, society itself is changing willy-nilly, even when the capitalist class doesn't understand what is actually happening. Well, of course, what one's referring to, if one looks at it in the crudest possible level, again, one looks at the politics which I've referred to, which is the fact that we have general elections. We have an elective form. Now, clearly, that elective form is very limited. We can go through all the different forms of that, the way it is, which have been described often enough. But it is obviously a movement. It's a movement away from the old society, which was simply ruled by the capitalist class directly. Now it's indirectly with governments elected every so many years, which is a difference, and does make a difference to what's actually occurring. So what we're talking about a transitional form, which is part of this decline and an integral part of this time. Of course, the whole discussion of decline is discussed by Lenin in some detail in his book on imperialism. But it was Trotsky who pushed the concept on transitional epoch, and which he saw it much more in terms of the area outside the USSR. That's in after 1917. But in fact, when we're talking about the whole world being in a period of change, the concept of a transitional epoch, to go to it, is put forward by Marx, and he he makes it clear that there will be such a thing, that the society is not going to simply go from a capitalist society to a social society, but in between there'll be a gradual change. The implication, of course, is that the working class takes power, and in that process, when it is in power, it is gradually able to change the society. Marx insists, to quote him in the Gotha program, that there is such a thing, or that there's a special phase of transition from capitalism to communism. So in other words, the decline is occurring at the same time as you're talking about a transition. So it's a complex argument. Quote Marx. He says, the first fact that has been established most accurately by the whole theory of development, by science as a whole, a fact that was ignored by the utopians and is ignored by present-day opportunists who are afraid of the socialist revolution, is that historically there must undoubtedly be a special stage or special phase of transition from capitalism to communism. Well, what I'm saying is that that original concept has fused with the concept of decline. It's clear that in this period from 1870 onwards, there has been considerable development. It hasn't been just a decline. The term decline is here much more complicated. What it's saying is that the growth rate and the possibility of change is considerably lower than it could be. I think that's the basic statement. The second statement is that the law of value itself is withering away. Now that's fairly obvious. That's at the present time. That's to say that when we today we can see it in the superficial form of money, in the way we using the banks today, or checks, or we simply fill in whatever it is in the bank form on your computer. Money is changing in its nature. What is more than that, in fact, is what's been referred to by the modern monetarist theory, which we discussed briefly last time, which I think has a lot going for it. It may not be correct in everything, but I would actually go further than they go on that, and say that on conditions where gold is not the basis of money, where money can simply be issued, it is issued, and you can't easily measure it. You can't measure what's going on because you don't know what is actually going on. That's to say, somebody could lend to somebody who could lend to somebody, etc., etc. That could go on. There could be a whole range of that going on in circles, double circles, or whatever it is. There's not an easy way to know what the total circulation of what amounts to money or pseudo money or replacement money or whatever you want. You can't actually know the extent to which it is actually operating, how far it's actually going. In general, as I said last time, I think the modern school point. Yes, what that means, what this is referring to, is the way governments today don't fully know what they're doing. That's say they don't have full control of what they're doing. This is simply an aspect of the of their decline. I started on this particular road about money when I said that the law of value is limited. That in fact there are two things going on. That it's hard to control the supply of money today. And of course, they try to do it one way or another. And the obvious way is just to have an absolute stop, as in one sense, as was done in this country in 2010, insofar as you can. So when they stopped the forms which were existing before 2010, the overall point then is that it's hard for any government today to simply control the economy itself using money. At the present time, if we look at it, of course, apart from the coronavirus, the government isn't really clear exactly what it's doing in monetary terms. It's issued, it says it's gone issue, what's it, 300 billion or something, and the amount which is actually used and how it is spread isn't very clear. Anyway, the point I was just trying to make there is that money isn't fully controllable in the present time. The law of value, in other words, isn't operating as a law of value. What's happening is some intermediate form between the law of value and planning exists. That's where we actually are. Well, at one level, as that, of course, is absolutely obvious. The fact is the government has a budget, and that budget in France is what officially 57% or something of GDP. In fact, the way is you can count GDP, you can easily make it a lot more. That's to say, you could, in Marxist terms, remove finance from that GDP, so you'll get a higher percentage in the budget. Anyway, the point is that capitalism is in decline in the sense of how it's actually run. It's not simply run by an independent market somehow or other. There is a measure of what one can call proto-planning going on within the society. And that is, of course, obvious, really. But that is the case. It's quite complex when one wants to go into it. I've only done that because there has been discussion to a considerable degree. So we're talking about existing the proto-planning forms. But of course, there are a whole series of other forms of regulation, which we don't have to go into, and which in the United States they specifically against. That's to say, the Trump government, as previous Republican governments, always want to deregulate. They're worried about regulation, but some form of regulation is essential in our developing society. So, well, the point I'm simply making is that capitalism is in decline. The forms which have actually come into existence are not socialist forms, but they're not classical capitalist forms that we would have understood them at the time when to which Lenin was actually referring, and it applies particularly strongly today. So I've just taken two forms of decline. One could, of course, go further today, if one's prepared to generalize it, because in the last 12 years, the rate of growth has been very low, and the productivity has been next to nothing. It's not surprising you get these kind of articles now being written by Martin Wolf, which he's just written, which implies we have to go towards a more regulated society. Of course, one can go further and look at the negative forms which have come into existence, but within capitalism itself. But I think I've spoken long enough. Thank you. Right.
Okay, thanks, Hillel. I'll now throw it open to questions and contributions. So if anybody on the panel would like to come in. Yasmin, did you say that you had a question that had been put in advance?
Hillel answered that question.
Okay,
sorry.
Fine. Okay, this is a question from me, Hillel. It's not a very long comment. I was interested in this point about regulation, and in particular the Martin Wolf article that you referred to, and I wondered how far you could comment on this in terms of political pressures for a sort of a managed form of capitalism. In other words, that this would be a response to, say, the so-called populist moment, or how far this is a sort of structural dynamic within capitalism. I know that you can't separate the two, but I'm interested in whether you think of this as primarily a political response, particularly in terms of growing forms of discontent and opposition, or how far it is simply, necessitated by the specific economic needs of the system. And then related to that, I'm quite interested, particularly in terms of the Johnson government, but I think this probably applies to many, other capitalist governments as well, is this idea of, quote, tearing up the economic textbooks or throwing away the rule book, and particularly Sunak's policies in terms of wage subsidies and general subsidies to capitalism, and particularly the impact of that. Do you see that as a sort of special aspect of this form of regulation, or is it really a is it simply a response to the crisis, or is it in a sense a development from these other tendencies that you've been talking about? But those are just some sort of initial comments and questions from me. So perhaps if you would like to respond to them, or I'll take some other comrades who want to come in.
Okay, so can you just give me a short idea of what your first question was? I've already forgotten it.
Yeah, the first question was about regulation, and how far regulation was. And I was particularly thinking of this article today by Martin Wolf, but how far regulation is a political response to sort of popular pressures, opposition, discontent, or how far it is structurally determined by by the dynamics of the system. I know that in a sense they're very closely related, but I was particularly interested in the ways that theorists and politicians and so on are trying to rehabilitate capitalism as a system. And so I was thinking of the political rather than than simply of the structural dynamics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the two questions are very close, in fact. Yeah, well, I'll take the second question first because it actually underlies what's happening. I think the Johnson government is a far-right government. They're quite clear about that. After all, Johnson was close to Trump and said so. So Trump is far right. I'm not clear what Johnson really is. That's something else. But insofar as he makes statements, and insofar as he's a prime minister and appears to be acting as prime minister, he appears to be on the far right. And one of the features of the far right is that while they are obviously supportive of capitalism, they're also critical of capitalism. If you actually look at it, after all, that was the nature of fascism. And that's what, I don't know, I'm not saying that Boris Johnson is a fascist, but it's one line, as it were, between them and fascism. So he is far right, and what I think that means is that they prepared to drop or overthrow aspects of the theory of capital. Whether they do it consciously or unconsciously doesn't make any difference. I think they are quite clear about that. That's to say, they overthrew the rule which David Cameron introduced after 2010 of austerity. And what lay behind austerity? They overthrew it. Now, or they said they overthrew it. What will actually happen from now onwards, I have no idea, because it looks to me like the government doesn't really know what it's doing anyway. But insofar as it has a program, that seems to be what its program is. That's on the far right, and that it therefore doesn't accept all the statements around capitalism. So from their point of view, there is no, they can take a Keynesian viewpoint, which would be a completely rational viewpoint if they were to actually do it. That's to say, they spend a lot more money in order to get the economy growing, and once you've got the more money in, you can then try and control it. I presume that's that's where they're going. The fact is, they've actually done it. Whether David Cameron would have done it, I don't know, or Theresa May, I would doubt it. So that's where they stand, I think. And in a sense, they threw away the rule book, but only in the sense which I've given. They are supportive of capitalism. The fact that I don't know if they actually refer to Keynes. They wouldn't have to. They don't have to take it like that, but they could. And what they did in this last year, in spending all that money, was the correct thing to do within capitalism. Had they not done it, there would have been absolute poverty and people dying in the streets. So they were virtually forced to do it. But I think they were in an intellectual position where they could do it, whereas the other two prime ministers I referred to would have been extremely worried about doing it. They might have got somewhere near it, or they might not. I have no idea. So anyway, where does this lead them? It does mean that they can cross various other lines as time goes on, both political and economic. But I don't think they will go on the government in the United States has changed. The relationship to the United States was intended to be closer than it was. They're relying on the United States to help them. I don't see why the United States will help them at this point, but matter of fact, from what Biden has said, he ought not to help them. But from what has been said today, in fact, in relation to Britain changing the duties on American planes, is it? Anyway, it's duties on some American item, which is seen in the reports which I read in the Financial Times. It's seen as a deliberate attempt to make up with the United States. So, as far as I can see, what this does mean is that in Britain, the government is going to try and go back to being a straightforward capitalist rather than on the far right. Regulations. It's true. One could write quite a few books on the subject. I think the way in which capitalism has introduced a series of regulations in order to maintain the market, while at the same time saying they don't like regulations and finding these same regulations a problem. Both statements that they find it a problem and they need them are true. So, of course, in the United States, you have this system whereby the Republican Party comes to power and then proceeds to deregulate, as Trump did. And of course, when it's then succeeded by another government which has to regulate anyway. And in fact, the regulations are necessary, and if they're not used, then they have to find some other mechanism to serve the purpose anyway. So it's a very inefficient way of actually running capitalism, but that is what they're doing. Okay.
Okay, Hillel, I've got another question here. It's from Geraldine Thorpe, and she says, could you expand on your idea of removing finance from GDP and how this would have an impact on the budget? And she talks about, probably is questioning whether you're talking about financial services, finance capital, the banks and so on.
I didn't catch could I expand on my idea of finance being removed from
GDP figures? And she says,
oh,
yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to. Well, the point is, from a Marxist point of view, finance is unproductive.
Yeah.
So, if one were to draw up a budget, a Marxist budget, or left-wing budget, whatever you call it, finance would not have added to the total product. So, if you're trying to work out a Marxist budget, you just don't include what people regard as an addition. The argument, of course, is that finance doesn't add in itself anything. It's simply counting.
Mm.
That Yes.
Thank
It's-
you. That's good. Thank you.
Okay, I'm now asking for any further contributions. I've had some comments coming in, but if there are any further, please.
I suppose I would like to ask a question. In terms of decline, how do we see it in terms of what will happen to the third world? I mean, as you rightly pointed out, Lenin's book on imperialism talks about decline. How do we see the future interventions of capital in the third world, given, first of all, nationalism inside the imperialist countries, but also the fact that there seems to be destruction as opposed to exploitation on most people's idea of dealing with the third world seems now to be no longer about exploitation, but about destruction. How do we envisage decline when it comes to capital's attitude beyond its own industrial zone in the third world? Sorry, Kevin, did you hear me?
Yes, I did. Sorry. Yeah. Hillel, did you hear Yasmin's question?
No, I couldn't catch it.
Okay, sorry. Yasmin was asking about capitalism's attitude towards the third world, and she talked in particular, or she suggested that it seemed to be resulting in a policy almost of destruction as opposed to exploitation, and she was suggesting a difference between sort of classic imperialism and then some contemporary form. I might just add the comment whether this is my comment, whether this is an accidental product or whether there is indeed some sort of policy behind it. But it's Yasmin was keen to sort of see the difference between the classic forms of exploitation and what is happening in the contemporary. And I would think possibly the issue of failed states as well would come into that. But again, that's my comment rather than Yasmin's.
Well, I'm glad Yasmin brought it up. I think it's quite true that if we look at the third world today, if we look at Africa and Latin America, one could see it in that form. There's no doubt of it. If you look at South Africa, then that's exactly what we see. That you had a deindustrialization rather than an industrialization. And South Africa is not the only example. I mean, it's not just true actually of the third world, but it's particularly true of the third world since they don't have anything else, as it were. And I think it is true that there hasn't been what could have happened, could have been the case. There hasn't been a transfer of capital to Africa and Latin America in which they could build up major industries and supply them to their own people and even export them. But that hasn't happened. If anything, it's a reverse. And it's, of course, I know a bit about South Africa, and the fact is the GDP before the coronavirus was not rising at all, zero. And if you look at the actual condition in South Africa, a large percentage of the population who are clearly not getting enough to eat. Now, this is a country which before Mandela came in had, of course, a majority of the population disfranchised, in which standard of living was very low. And the fact is, it remained low. The fact is that such industry as was there has tended to leave or not advance. I think that is generally true. You've had a process of deindustrialization, which doesn't only affect the third world, it affects the first world. It's affected Britain, as we know, in the north of England, most particularly, but it's been general. It's I think Yasser was absolutely right. The effect is, of course, that the third world is in a dire situation, with exception of China and the Chinese-related countries. They're in a dire situation, getting worse. I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing it up.
Okay, Hillel, and you're working very hard this evening. I'd like to just ask a question on China and the way that you classify China there as an emerging power. And I've heard you talk about this before, but I wondered if any recent developments had made you think that China would be in a position to be a serious contender to overtake the United States, or whether, as many comrades do, assume that America, although in decline, will still remain the dominant economic and political power. I wondered if you could foresee China being in a position to seriously challenge the United States.
Yes. Well, the commentators are effectively now saying that, but just in the last few months, they're paying tribute to China because it's got a growth rate of 4.9% in its third quarter, as opposed, of course, to the negative growth rates in the West. I don't know how long China's going to go on like this, because it's not very simple. It's clearly state capitalist. Today is not the same. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago. Today we're talking about a country where somewhere, according to what I'm reading, 60 to 80% of its industry is private, and where you have quite a few multimillionaires. So you have private property, you have private firms, and say 60 to 80% of its economy is private. The banks are not. The banks, some banks maybe, but the major banks are owned by the state. So the state remains in control, and it remains in control through banks and through other institutions. But the fact is that the economy is increasingly private and privatized. And it has its own stock exchange, and it is quoted on Wall Street. And you might have noticed that Trump passed a law under which the Chinese firms which have registered on the American stock exchanges will have to conform to certain rules. And the question is whether they will be able to. So some proportion may be able to. But the point is, of course, that by registering in the United States, it means that they're getting substantial investment from the United States itself in China. It's private enterprise from the United States in China. And quite apart from that, there is substantial investment in China from the United States. And China itself, of course, is investing in a whole series of countries around the world, most particularly in the third world, but it's investing insofar as it can in the first world. But as it invested in Germany, but the Germans made certain that after they bought a particular firm, factory, etc., they couldn't do it again. Nonetheless, they own Volvo, for instance. So the Chinese are already a world power. There's no question that of them becoming one. They are one. If you look at the figures of imports and exports, etc., then it's quite clear. The question then is, what on earth is this entity? Well, I just call it state capitalist, but it's not a sufficient understanding. The way I understand it, which may be completely wrong, is that in fact the Communist Party in China was not very different from the Communist Party in Russia, and it could or might have been prepared to go the same way as the Russian elite went. But when I saw what happened to Russia, that's to say, it was basically unable to penetrate the world market. And on the contrary, the world market could penetrate it. It couldn't actually exist as a major capitalist power, and that in fact it wasn't really able to develop. And in fact, it was just left with oil. Most of its industry became worthless. So once it saw the ruination of Russia, which is what occurred precisely because the West wouldn't make the concessions which were required, I think they were frightened by that, and they decided they just couldn't do it. So they maintained control. I think that's it. I don't know, but I would guess that that's a powerful reason why the existing elite in the Communist Party have maintained control. Because of course, if you look at what their doctrine is, it is Stalinist. It's simply nonsense if one reads it in those terms. But in terms of their own government and looking at what they're actually doing, they obviously don't bother with that Stalinism, and simply, I suppose they would be using standard textbooks and standard works in order to understand how to run firms and how to develop them and so forth. So in that sense, it is capitalist. In the other sense, that they've maintained control and don't want to lose control because they're afraid of what might happen, and reckon that by continuing to expand and develop, which they can do, but they're some stages away from the development that you have in the United States, as far as I understand it. They can maintain themselves and actually develop. And the logic of where they're going is that within some finite time, I don't know what it is, 20 to 30 years, they will reach the level of the United States. And there's no war possible because both sides have got atomic weapons. It's simply ruled out. So there won't be any wars. The United States may try to do what Trump is doing, but as I understand it, that's stupid. Only an idiot would do it. I would think that the new government will take a more sensible attitude towards China, understand that it will continue to develop, but at the same time, try to ensure that they remain one step ahead or something like that. So in the end, I think what one's talking about is an entity, that's to say China, which is in some sense capitalist, but in also some sense very much a transitional regime, which might well continue in that direction because it's forced to by the rest of the world. Yeah.
Good.
Okay, thanks, Hillel, for that reply. It's given me some further thoughts. You've been, as I say, you've been working quite hard tonight, the sole panelist. Are there any further questions or comments at all, comrades, before we wind up?
I just make one last comment, probably. I'm sure Hillel has followed. There's a Financial Times report about China's advances in quantum computing. And in some ways, that is quite phenomenal, in that for the first time, we can say that in terms of new technology, China has taken over the West. I would also say that China has taken over on the production of some forms of high performance computing in addition to quantum computing. Do you think that technology, in comparison with other characteristics of a superpower, of a hegemon power, plays a lesser important role? So in our definition of a hegemon power, we've always said it's both military power, in this case air power, it is the dominance of the finance sector of US economy, and thirdly, it is, if you like, technological advances. On the first two, I think China is very far away still, as you said, 2 decades, maybe longer. In technology, it seems to be making leaps forward. Can this compensate for their lack of progress in the other two areas, in terms of even in terms of nuclear power? I realize no one is going to use the nuclear power, but there is a competition on how many warheads, how many nuclear bombs. China is far behind. Even with Russia, it would still be far behind. In terms of economy, it's still far behind. But I would say the last few months' advances in China in terms of technology have been phenomenal. Can they compensate their backwardness in the other two areas with technology? Kevin, you might have to repeat my question if my audio wasn't good.
Okay, Hillel, did you hear Yasmin's question?
No.
Okay. Right. I hope I can do it justice. Yasmin's referring to some recent developments in Chinese quantum computing, and in particular a series of reports in the FT that in this important area that China has now taken the lead. And what she's asking is, we define a hegemonic power in various ways, and we talk about its financial, its economic, its political, military dominance. But what Yasmin wanted to get your thoughts on was whether this lead in technology would compensate for its backwardness in other areas. So I suppose she's really talking about this almost combined and uneven development, that in this area, which is obviously economically very significant, China has taken a very strong lead, and she's asking whether that lead would be enough to increase China's potential, or whether we still need to think about a whole range of factors. So it's really about the importance of technology, and particularly this quantum computing area that China's taken a lead in.
Well, I don't know. I can say I only follow. I'm not an expert on China. It's true that it, in one sense, it's got a long way to go, but in another sense, it doesn't. It depends what you're actually looking at, which is what you're also saying. I don't know. Is basically the answer. I don't know in the first instance whether the Chinese society can continue as it is. After all, it is a bureaucratically managed society. It's controlled from above. The majority of the population obviously have their critique of it, as would be true of any population anywhere. And how far an undemocratic society like that can go on at a point where it is highly developed, where people are objecting to various controls, I don't know. I mean, one could argue that there's a certain point at which it would simply fall apart. I suppose you could, in some sense, that's what happened to the Soviet Union. So I don't really know. On the other hand, of course, it's true that they have developed in science and the economy in general phenomenally, and it may be possible to maintain that, given the fact that the alternative isn't so clear. What on earth is the alternative? From the point of view of the majority of the population, the alternative isn't the same as what it appears to be for a Chinese millionaire or billionaire, or even a high-ranking Chinese scientist. After all, they may want one thing. The majority might say, well, if we get what you're talking about, we aren't going to be any better off. I don't know what this would amount to. Asking is it possible that there be a genuine socialist party formed in China which would get substantial support? I can't answer that question. I just don't know. If we as socialists think that socialism is necessary and good for the world, then it must be possible at some point that the majority would want to go that way. But when they would want to go that way, I don't know.
Okay, Hillel. I don't see any further questions. So I wondered if you would just like to sum up or make a few closing comments, and just to thank you for your participation. So if you've got any final closing points till before we go.
No, it's
Okay, right.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing you again, probably in the new year.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.